They say the deepest cuts come from those closest to your heart. But I never imagined my own daughter would be the one wielding the knife. When someone you raised, nurtured, and sacrificed everything for looks you in the eye and tells you you're worthless, outdated, and irrelevant, it doesn't just sting. It shatters something fundamental inside you. But sometimes, that shattering is exactly what you need to rebuild yourself stronger than ever before. Good evening, everyone. This is Margaret Thompson, 58 years old, speaking to you from my home office in Denver, Colorado. What you're about to hear is the story of how my daughter's cruel words became the catalyst for the most unexpected chapter of my life. A chapter that proved that experience, wisdom, and determination can triumph over youth, arrogance, and entitlement in ways that no one saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My story begins not in the corporate boardrooms where it would eventually unfold, but in a small two-bedroom apartment in Cincinnati, Ohio, back in 1987. I was 21 years old, fresh out of community college with an associate degree in business administration, and completely unprepared for the reality that was about to hit me like a freight train. My husband at the time, David Thompson, was a charming man with big dreams and an even bigger mouth. He worked sporadically in construction, always chasing the next big opportunity that never seemed to materialize. When I discovered I was pregnant with our daughter Sarah, David's response wasn't joy or excitement. It was panic. Not the kind of panic that motivates a man to step up and provide for his family, but the kind that makes him disappear for days at a time, leaving behind nothing but empty promises and unpaid bills. Sarah Elizabeth Thompson was born on a cold November morning in 1987, and from the moment I held her in my arms, I knew that everything had changed. Not just in the way that all new mothers feel, but in a deeper, more fundamental way. Looking into those bright blue eyes, I made a promise that would shape the next 3 decades of my life. This little girl would never want for anything that I could possibly provide, and she would have every opportunity that I never had. David left for good when Sarah was just 8 months old. I came home from my job at a small accounting firm one evening to find a note on the kitchen table and half our belongings gone. "I'm not cut out for this family thing, Maggie," the note read in his sloppy handwriting. "You and the baby will be better off without me dragging you down." In a way, he was right, though not for the reasons he thought. Suddenly, I was a single mother with a baby, a part-time job that barely covered rent, and no family support system to speak of. My parents had passed away in a car accident during my senior year of high school, and David's family had never approved of me. Apparently, I wasn't good enough for their golden boy, who couldn't hold down a job for more than 6 months. Those first few years were a masterclass in survival. I worked days at Morrison & Associates, a small CPA firm where I handled basic bookkeeping and filing. The pay was minimal, but my boss, Harold Morrison, was a kind man in his 60s who understood my situation. He let me bring Sarah to work when I couldn't find childcare, and he even gave me small raises whenever he could justify them to his business partner. But one job wasn't enough. Evenings, I cleaned office buildings downtown, pushing Sarah's stroller through empty corridors while I emptied trash cans and vacuumed carpets. Weekends, I did freelance bookkeeping for small businesses, working at our tiny kitchen table while Sarah napped or played quietly with her few toys. I remember one particularly difficult night in the winter of 1989. Sarah, now a toddler of 2, had been sick with a fever for 3 days. I'd already missed 2 days of work at the accounting firm, and I couldn't afford to miss another. But I also couldn't take a sick child to the office buildings I cleaned. So I called in sick to my evening job, knowing it meant losing a day's pay that I desperately needed for rent. As I sat in our dim living room holding my feverish daughter and listening to the radiator clank and struggle to heat our inadequate apartment, I made another promise. This wasn't going to be our life forever. I was going to find a way to build something better, something stable, something that would give Sarah the security and opportunities she deserved. That determination led me to make a decision that would prove crucial years later. I enrolled in night classes at the University of Cincinnati, working toward a bachelor's degree in business administration. It took me 6 years, attending classes 2 nights a week and every other Saturday. But I graduated in 1995 with a 3.8 GPA and a mountain of student loan debt that felt overwhelming at the time. During those college years, something interesting happened at Morrison and Associates. Harold Morrison's business partner retired, and instead of hiring another CPA, Harold offered me a promotion to office manager. It wasn't a huge leap in salary, but it came with real responsibilities and, more importantly, Harold's trust. He began teaching me aspects of the business that went far beyond basic bookkeeping, tax preparation, financial planning, client relations, and business development. "You have an intuitive understanding of numbers, Margaret," Harold would tell me as we worked late into the evening, preparing for tax season. "But more than that, you understand people. That's a combination that's rarer than you might think in this business." By the time I graduated from college, I had essentially become Harold's right hand. I knew every client's file, understood their business challenges, and had developed relationships that went beyond mere professional courtesy. When Harold suffered a heart attack in 1996, I practically ran the firm single-handedly for 3 months while he recovered. It was during this period that I first demonstrated the skills that would eventually lead to my greatest professional triumph, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Morrison and Associates was struggling with several clients who were considering switching to larger firms that offered more comprehensive services. Rather than lose them, I proposed something radical. Why not expand our offerings? I spent evenings and weekends researching business consulting services, financial planning strategies, and modern accounting software. I created detailed proposals for how we could modernize our operations while maintaining the personal touch that our clients valued. When Harold returned to work, I presented him with a complete business transformation plan. "This is remarkable work, Margaret," he said, looking through my meticulously prepared presentation. "But implementing all of this would require significant investment and a lot of risk." "Mr. Morrison," I replied, feeling more confident than I had in years, "we're already at risk. The business world is changing, and we can either change with it or watch our clients walk away to firms that offer what they need." Harold studied my proposal for weeks, consulting with his accountant, his lawyer, and even his wife. Finally, he called me into his office on a Friday afternoon in late 1996. "I've decided to implement your plan," he announced, "but with one condition. I want you to oversee the entire transformation as our new Associate Director of Client Services. It's a position I'm creating specifically for you, and it comes with a salary increase and profit sharing that reflects the value you bring to this firm." I was stunned. At 30 years old, as a single mother with no family connections or business pedigree, I was being handed real authority and responsibility. More importantly, I was being given the chance to prove that my ideas, my work ethic, and my understanding of both numbers and people could drive real business success. The transformation of Morrison and Associates took 2 years, and it wasn't always smooth. We invested in new computer systems that seemed impossibly complex at the time. We hired 2 additional CPAs and a part-time business consultant. We restructured our fee schedules and expanded our service offerings to include financial planning, business consulting, and tax strategy services that went far beyond basic preparation. There were moments when I questioned everything, late nights when the new software crashed, and I had to manually recreate hours of work. Difficult conversations with longtime clients who were resistant to change. Budget meetings where every expense had to be justified and rejustified. But by 1998, our client base had not only stabilized but grown by 40%. Our revenue had doubled, and Morrison and Associates had gained a reputation as one of the most innovative small accounting firms in Cincinnati. Other firms began copying our service model, and Harold was invited to speak at regional CPA conferences about successful business transformation. Through all of this professional growth, Sarah was thriving as well. She was 11 years old in 1998, a bright and articulate 6th grader who excelled in school and showed early signs of the intelligence and determination that I hoped would carry her far in life. I made sure she understood the value of education and hard work, often bringing her to the office on weekends so she could see firsthand what dedication and persistence could accomplish. "Mom, why do you work so much?" she asked me one Saturday afternoon, as I prepared client presentations at my desk while she did homework at the conference table. "Because I want to build something lasting," I explained, looking up from the financial projections I was reviewing. "Not just for me, but for you." I want you to see that with enough determination and smart work, you can create opportunities that didn't exist before." Sarah nodded solemnly, and I believed she understood. She was watching me transform not just our business but our entire lives. We had moved from that cramped apartment to a modest but comfortable house in a good school district. I could afford to buy her clothes from department stores instead of thrift shops, and she participated in after-school activities without me having to worry about the fees. What I didn't fully appreciate at the time was that Sarah was also developing her own relationship with success and achievement. She was consistently at the top of her class, popular with her peers, and showed natural leadership abilities that teachers and other parents regularly commented on. While I was proud of her accomplishments, I failed to notice that her success was beginning to create a sense of entitlement that would eventually become problematic. In 1999, when Sarah was 12, Harold Morrison made an announcement that would change both of our lives dramatically. At 67 years old, he was ready to retire, but he didn't want to sell Morrison and Associates to a larger firm that might eliminate jobs or change the culture we had worked so hard to build. "Margaret," he said during what I thought was a routine Monday morning meeting, "I've been thinking about succession planning, and I have a proposition for you." What followed was a conversation that I could never have imagined when I was that desperate young mother cleaning office buildings at night. Harold wanted to structure a gradual transition that would allow me to purchase the firm over a period of 5 years, using profits and performance bonuses to offset the purchase price. "You've already proven that you can run this business," he explained. "You understand the clients, you've modernized our operations, and you have the respect of everyone we work with. More importantly, you have the vision to take this firm places I never could have imagined." The paperwork was complex, the financial arrangements required careful planning, and the transition timeline stretched over 2 years. But by 2001, at the age of 35, I had become the majority owner and president of what was now Thompson & Associates, a growing accounting and business consulting firm with 12 employees and a client list that included some of the most successful small and medium-sized businesses in the Cincinnati metropolitan area. Sarah was 14 when I officially took control of the firm, and I could see in her eyes a mixture of pride and something else that I couldn't quite identify at the time. Later, I would recognize it as the beginning of a fundamental shift in how she saw me, how she saw success, and how she saw her own place in the world. Looking back now, I realize that those foundational years, from desperate single mother to business owner, were not just about building financial security or professional success. They were about developing the skills, relationships, and confidence that would eventually allow me to face the greatest challenge of my life, proving my worth to my own daughter and her husband, who would come to see me as nothing more than an outdated relic from a bygone era. But that's a story for the next chapter of this journey, when Sarah's academic achievements and my business success would collide in ways that neither of us could have anticipated. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The early 2000s brought a level of stability and success that I had never imagined possible during those desperate years as a young single mother. Thompson & Associates was thriving, my reputation in the Cincinnati business community was solid, and Sarah was excelling in high school with grades that virtually guaranteed her acceptance to any university she chose. But success, I was learning, brought its own set of challenges, particularly when it came to raising a teenager who had never experienced the kind of financial uncertainty that had shaped my own character. Sarah entered Walnut Hills High School in 2001 as a confident, articulate 15-year-old who seemed destined for greatness. She was immediately accepted into the International Baccalaureate program, joined the debate team, and became involved in student government. Teachers consistently praised her analytical thinking and leadership potential, often telling me during parent conferences that Sarah was college material and bound for big things. I was proud, of course, but I also began to notice subtle changes in Sarah's attitude toward work and achievement. Where I had learned to value persistence and gradual progress, Sarah seemed to expect immediate results and recognition. Where I had developed patience through years of small victories and incremental improvements, Sarah displayed increasing frustration when things didn't come easily. The first real sign of trouble came during her junior year, when she was struggling with advanced placement chemistry. For the first time in her academic career, Sarah was earning B's and C's instead of her usual A's. Her response wasn't to increase her study time or seek additional help. It was to blame the teacher. "Mr. Patterson is incompetent," she announced over dinner one evening in late 2003. "He can't explain anything clearly, and his tests don't match what he teaches in class. Half the kids in my class are failing." "Have you considered getting a tutor?" I suggested. "Or spending more time on the homework assignments?" Sarah's response was swift and dismissive. "Mom, I shouldn't need a tutor for a high school class. The problem isn't me, it's the teaching. You wouldn't understand because you never took advanced science courses." There it was, the first hint of the condescension that would eventually define our relationship. Sarah had begun to view my community college education and practical business experience as somehow inferior to her advanced academic coursework. In her mind, my success was the result of luck and circumstance, while her achievements reflected superior intelligence and capability. I let the comment pass at the time, attributing it to typical teenage frustration. But similar incidents began occurring with increasing frequency. When I shared stories about challenging business situations I had navigated, Sarah would respond with barely concealed impatience. When I offered advice about time management or problem solving, she would dismiss my suggestions as old-fashioned or not applicable to her situation. The irony was that my business was becoming more successful than ever, largely due to my ability to adapt to rapidly changing technology and business practices. By 2004, Thompson & Associates had been one of the first small accounting firms in Ohio to fully integrate internet-based client services, cloud storage systems, and sophisticated financial modeling software. We were regularly consulted by larger firms about our technology implementation strategies, but none of this seemed to impress Sarah, who had become fixated on what she saw as the outdated nature of traditional business practices. She was 17 years old, and already convinced that her generation possessed insights and capabilities that older professionals simply couldn't match. "Mom, you're still using Excel for financial projections," she observed one Saturday when she accompanied me to the office. "There are much more sophisticated programs available now. You should probably hire someone younger to handle your technology upgrades." I looked up from the complex financial model I was building for a client's expansion project, a model that would help them secure a $2.3 million loan and create 47 new jobs. This outdated Excel spreadsheet represents about 6 hours of work that will save our client approximately $180,000 in unnecessary borrowing costs, I replied calmly. Sometimes experience and practical knowledge matter more than having the latest software. Sarah shrugged, clearly unconvinced. "If you say so. But efficiency is about working smarter, not harder." That phrase, "working smarter, not harder," became something of a mantra for Sarah during her senior year. She had embraced the idea that intelligence and technological savvy could substitute for the kind of grinding persistence that had characterized my own career development. It was a seductive philosophy for a young person who had never faced real professional challenges or economic uncertainty. Her college application process reflected this mindset perfectly. While I had attended community college and then worked my way through a public university over 6 years, Sarah set her sights exclusively on prestigious private institutions. When I suggested that she consider some excellent state schools that would provide outstanding education at a fraction of the cost, her response was immediate and sharp. "Mom, I'm not going to limit my potential because of money. You've built a successful business. You can afford to invest in my education. Besides, the networking opportunities at elite schools are worth the tuition premium. It's about positioning myself for maximum career impact." I wondered where she had picked up this language, positioning for maximum career impact, and realized that she was already beginning to think of herself as fundamentally different from the working-class family background that had shaped our lives. In her mind, her academic achievements had elevated her to a different social and professional category. Sarah was accepted to Northwestern University, Duke, and Georgetown, ultimately choosing Northwestern's prestigious business program. The tuition, room, and board costs were staggering, nearly $45,000 per year. But I had saved diligently, and Thompson & Associates was generating enough revenue to manage the expense without compromising our family's financial security. What I couldn't manage was the emotional distance that seemed to grow between us with each semester. Sarah threw herself into college life with the same intensity she had always applied to academics, but her calls home became increasingly brief and perfunctory. When she did share details about her studies, internships, and social activities, there was an unmistakable undertone of superiority. "I'm learning so much about modern business strategy," she told me during a call in the fall of her sophomore year. "My professors have such incredible experience with Fortune 500 companies and international markets. It's amazing how much the business world has evolved beyond traditional small-town approaches." I bit my tongue rather than point out that my traditional small-town approach was paying for her education at one of the country's most expensive universities. Instead, I asked about her specific coursework and tried to find common ground in our shared interest in business principles. But even these conversations revealed a growing philosophical divide. Sarah was being trained in theoretical frameworks and case study methodologies that, while valuable, seemed to dismiss the kind of practical, relationship-based business development that had built Thompson and Associates. Her professors emphasized scalability, optimization, and data-driven decision-making in ways that implicitly criticized smaller, more personal approaches to client service. The summer after her sophomore year, Sarah secured an internship with a large consulting firm in Chicago, rather than coming home to work at Thompson and Associates, as I had hoped. When I expressed disappointment, her response was telling. "Mom, I need to gain experience with sophisticated business operations. Working at your firm would be fine for understanding basic accounting practices, but it wouldn't give me exposure to the kind of strategic thinking and complex problem-solving that modern businesses require." There it was again, the implication that my work was basic, and that real business sophistication existed only in large corporate environments. I tried to explain that many of the strategic challenges we faced at Thompson and Associates were remarkably similar to those encountered by much larger organizations, just at a different scale. But Sarah seemed convinced that size and prestige were reliable indicators of complexity and professional value. Her internship experience only reinforced these beliefs. She returned to school that fall full of stories about cutting-edge analytical tools, revolutionary business models, and disruptive innovation strategies. She spoke about her work with the reverence typically reserved for scientific breakthroughs, as if the business practices she was learning represented entirely new forms of human knowledge. It was during her junior year that Sarah met Bradley Mitchell, the man who would eventually become her husband and my most significant professional adversary. Bradley was a year ahead of Sarah at Northwestern, studying finance with a concentration in investment banking. He came from old money. His father was a partner at a prestigious Chicago law firm, and his mother served on the boards of several cultural institutions. When Sarah first brought Bradley home for Thanksgiving in 2006, I was impressed by his intelligence and articulate manner. He was clearly bright, well-educated, and ambitious. He was also polite to me in a way that felt slightly patronizing, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The three of us had dinner at one of Cincinnati's better restaurants, and Bradley asked thoughtful questions about my business and the local economic climate. But there was something in his tone that suggested he was conducting an anthropological study rather than engaging in genuine professional conversation. "It's fascinating how regional business cultures develop their own distinct characteristics," he observed over dessert. "I imagine that operating in a smaller market allows for much more personal relationships with clients, which must be quite rewarding even if it limits scalability." The comment was polite enough, but it contained an implicit dismissal of everything I had built. Bradley was suggesting that my success was the result of operating in a limited, less competitive environment, that what I had accomplished was charming but fundamentally small-scale. Sarah clearly adored him, and I could understand why. Bradley represented everything she had come to associate with success and sophistication. He spoke confidently about international markets, complex financial instruments, and career opportunities that existed far beyond the boundaries of regional business development. After they left to return to school, I found myself questioning my own achievements for the first time in years. Was Thompson and Associates really as successful as I believed, or was I simply a moderately competent fish in a very small pond? Had my pride in building the business from nothing blinded me to its fundamental limitations? These doubts intensified as Sarah's senior year progressed, and her relationship with Bradley became more serious. Their conversations, when I was allowed to overhear them, were filled with references to career trajectories, industry disruption, and value creation that made my own professional vocabulary seem quaint by comparison. Sarah graduated summa cum laude in the spring of 2008, and I felt an enormous sense of pride watching her walk across that stage. Everything I had worked for, every sacrifice I had made, every late night spent building the business, had led to this moment. My daughter had achieved the kind of academic success that I could never have imagined when I was struggling to keep us afloat in that tiny Cincinnati apartment. But as we celebrated at an expensive restaurant near campus, surrounded by other successful families congratulating their accomplished children, I realized that Sarah's success had created an unexpected problem. She no longer saw herself as connected to the working-class origins that had motivated my own career development. In her mind, her achievements had established her as a member of a different social and professional class, one that looked down on the kind of small-scale, relationship-based business practices that had made those achievements possible. Bradley proposed that summer, presenting Sarah with a ring that probably cost more than I had earned in my first 3 years of business. They were planning a wedding for the following year, and had already begun discussing their shared professional ambitions. Bradley had secured a position with Goldman Sachs in New York, while Sarah was considering offers from several major consulting firms. I was happy for them, of course, but I was also beginning to understand that my relationship with my daughter was about to change in ways that I wasn't prepared for. Sarah was entering a world where success was measured by entirely different standards than those that had guided my own career. And in that world, Thompson and Associates, and by extension Margaret Thompson, represented exactly the kind of outdated, limited thinking that ambitious young professionals were supposed to transcend. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test everything I believed about myself, my capabilities, and the value of the experience I had spent decades accumulating. But I wouldn't fully understand the depth of the challenge until Sarah and Bradley's critical assessment of my professional relevance became impossible to ignore. Sarah and Bradley's wedding in June 2009 was everything I had never imagined I could afford when she was a little girl. The ceremony took place at the Cincinnati Museum Center, with a reception for 180 guests at the Omni Netherland Plaza. The cost was astronomical, nearly $65,000, but seeing my daughter radiant in her designer gown, surrounded by friends and family celebrating her happiness, made every penny feel worthwhile. What I didn't anticipate was how the wedding would serve as a stark reminder of the social and professional divide that had opened between us. Bradley's family arrived like visiting royalty, impeccably dressed and speaking in the coded language of old money about their connections to various cultural institutions, charitable foundations, and exclusive clubs. His father, Charles Mitchell III, was a managing partner at Mitchell, Barnes & Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms. His mother, Catherine, chaired the board of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and had attended Wellesley with the daughters of several Fortune 500 CEOs. Their wedding gift to Sarah and Bradley was a down payment on a Manhattan apartment, a casual $150,000 gesture that they presented as if it were a modest contribution. During the rehearsal dinner, I found myself seated at a table with Bradley's extended family and several of their family friends. The conversation naturally turned to business and career prospects, and I was asked the inevitable question about my own professional background. Margaret runs a very successful accounting practice here in Cincinnati, Sarah explained before I could respond. There was something in her tone, a slight emphasis on here in Cincinnati, that felt like an apology for my geographic and professional limitations. How interesting, responded Bradley's aunt, Victoria Mitchell Hayes, who apparently managed investment portfolios for high-net-worth individuals. The accounting field has changed so dramatically with automation and artificial intelligence. I imagine it's quite challenging for smaller practices to stay competitive. The comment was delivered with a smile, but its implication was clear. My business represented an outdated model that was rapidly becoming obsolete. I could have explained that Thompson & Associates had been early adopters of most technological innovations in our field, or that our client base had grown by 35% in the previous 3 years precisely because we combined technological efficiency with personalized service. Instead, I simply smiled and changed the subject, but the conversation stayed with me throughout the evening and into the wedding day itself. As I watched Sarah and Bradley exchange vows, promising to support each other's professional ambitions and personal growth, I found myself wondering what role I would play in their lives going forward. Would I be the proud mother who had enabled Sarah's success? Or would I become an embarrassing reminder of humble origins that they preferred to minimize? The answer came sooner than I expected. 3 months after the wedding, Sarah called with news that she and Bradley had both accepted positions in New York. She with McKinsey & Company, and he with Goldman Sachs. They were relocating immediately, and their new salaries were, in Sarah's words, absolutely transformational. Mom, Bradley's starting salary is $165,000, and mine is $145,000, she announced with barely contained excitement. Can you believe it? In our first year out of college, we're going to earn more than most people make in Cincinnati after decades of experience. I felt a complex mix of emotions hearing this news. Pride in Sarah's achievements, certainly, but also a growing sense that her success was being defined in ways that implicitly diminished the value of everything I had accomplished. The comparison to most people in Cincinnati felt particularly pointed, as if geographic location and industry prestige were reliable measures of professional worth. Their move to New York accelerated changes that had been developing for years. Phone calls became less frequent and more superficial. When Sarah did call, she seemed constantly distracted by the demands of her new position and the social obligations that came with their elevated lifestyle. You wouldn't believe how intense it is here, she told me during one brief conversation in late 2009. The learning curve is incredible. We're working on client engagements worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The analytical frameworks we use are so sophisticated that it's like speaking an entirely different language. I tried to engage by asking about specific projects and methodologies, but Sarah seemed reluctant to discuss details. Whether this was due to confidentiality requirements or a belief that I wouldn't understand the complexity of her work, I couldn't determine. Either way, our conversations increasingly felt like progress reports, rather than meaningful exchanges between mother and daughter. Bradley's career trajectory was even more dramatic. Within 18 months, he had been promoted twice and was managing investment portfolios worth more than $50 million. Their combined income had reached nearly $400,000 by 2011, and they had moved to a larger apartment on the Upper East Side that cost more per month than most people in my neighborhood earned in a year. It was during this period of rapid professional advancement that I began to notice changes in how they spoke about business, success, and the broader economy. Their language became increasingly theoretical and abstract, filled with references to market inefficiencies, algorithmic trading strategies, and disruptive innovation models that seemed designed more to demonstrate sophistication than to communicate useful information. When they visited Cincinnati for Christmas in 2011, the disconnect became impossible to ignore. Over dinner at my house, the same house where Sarah had grown up and which I had thought she remembered fondly, the conversation turned to the economic challenges facing small businesses in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. I mentioned that Thompson and Associates had actually grown during the recession by helping struggling businesses restructure their operations and develop more efficient financial management systems. Several of our clients had not only survived but emerged stronger due to strategic planning and careful resource allocation. "That's nice, Mom," Sarah responded with the kind of patience typically reserved for a child's innocent observation. But you have to understand that the real economic drivers are much more complex than individual business performance. The structural challenges facing regional economies require systemic solutions that go beyond traditional service provision. Bradley nodded in agreement. The data clearly shows that economic resilience is increasingly concentrated in urban innovation hubs that can attract and retain high-value knowledge workers. Small-town business models are essentially fighting against inevitable demographic and technological trends. I sat there listening to my daughter and her husband explain why everything I had built was fundamentally irrelevant to the modern economy. They spoke with the confidence of people who had read the right books, attended the right schools, and worked for the right companies. People who possessed insights that were simply unavailable to those operating in less sophisticated environments. What struck me most was not just their dismissal of my professional experience, but their apparent belief that they understood business principles better than someone who had spent decades actually running a business. Their theoretical knowledge, gained through case studies and consulting frameworks, had convinced them that practical experience was somehow inferior to academic analysis. The conversation became even more uncomfortable when they began discussing their own career prospects and long-term financial planning. Bradley was considering business school applications, targeting Wharton or Stanford programs that would position him for eventual partnership track opportunities. Sarah was exploring lateral moves to more prestigious consulting firms or corporate strategy roles that would accelerate her advancement timeline. The key is positioning yourself for maximum optionality, Bradley explained, using language that sounded like it had been lifted directly from a career planning seminar. You want to build a resume that demonstrates scalable competencies and cross-industry applicability. Exactly, Sarah agreed. It's about creating a personal brand that transcends geographic or sector limitations. The goal is to become the kind of professional who can add value in any context, not someone who's trapped in regional or industry-specific expertise. I couldn't help but notice that their description of trapped professionals seemed to apply perfectly to my own career path. I had built deep expertise in accounting, taxation, and business consulting within a specific geographic market. My value proposition was based on relationships, local knowledge, and practical problem-solving skills that had been developed through years of hands-on experience. According to Sarah and Bradley's framework, this made me exactly the kind of limited, non-scalable professional who would struggle to remain relevant in an increasingly dynamic economy. They weren't being deliberately cruel. They were simply applying analytical models that categorized my career approach as fundamentally outdated. The real turning point came later that evening, when Sarah asked to see some of the marketing materials and client presentations I had been developing for Thompson & Associates. I was actually quite proud of these materials, which combined traditional financial analysis with innovative service delivery models that we had piloted over the previous 2 years. Sarah reviewed the documents with the focused attention of a consultant evaluating a client's operational readiness. After about 20 minutes, she looked up with an expression that managed to combine sympathy with professional assessment. "Mom, these are really well-intentioned," she began, "but they're honestly quite dated from a strategic perspective. Your value proposition is very relationship-focused, which works fine for local markets, but it doesn't scale effectively. And your analytical methodologies are pretty basic compared to what sophisticated clients expect nowadays." She went on to explain, in the same tone she might use to counsel a struggling client, how Thompson & Associates could potentially modernize its approach by adopting more contemporary frameworks and data-driven analytics. Her suggestions included hiring consultants to redesign our service offerings, investing in expensive software platforms that would automate much of what we currently did manually, and restructuring our fee schedules to emphasize value-based pricing rather than traditional hourly billing. The goal would be to transform your practice from a traditional accounting firm into a comprehensive business solutions provider, she concluded. It would require significant investment and a complete operational overhaul, but it might allow you to remain competitive for a few more years. I thanked her for the analysis and quietly put the materials away. But her words continued to echo in my mind long after she and Bradley had returned to New York. My daughter, the person whose education I had funded, whose success I had enabled, whose achievements I celebrated, had essentially told me that my professional competence was inadequate for modern business requirements. More painful than the specific criticisms was the underlying assumption that guided her assessment. Sarah genuinely believed that her theoretical knowledge and exposure to prestigious business environments had given her insights that I simply couldn't possess. In her mind, my decades of practical experience were not just different from her academic training. They were inferior to it. This realization marked the beginning of what I now recognize as the most challenging period of my professional life. For the first time since those early days as a desperate single mother, I found myself questioning not just my business strategies, but my fundamental competence as a professional. The seeds of doubt that Sarah and Bradley had planted would soon grow into a crisis of confidence that would force me to make choices I never expected to face. But they would also ultimately lead to discoveries about my own capabilities that would surprise everyone, including myself. The months following Sarah and Bradley's assessment of my business were among the most difficult of my professional life. Their words had planted seeds of doubt that grew into a full-blown crisis of confidence that affected every aspect of how I approached my work. For the first time in decades, I found myself second-guessing decisions that I would have made instinctively. When preparing client presentations, I wondered if my analytical methods were truly as basic as Sarah had suggested. When discussing strategic planning with business owners, I questioned whether my recommendations reflected outdated thinking that more sophisticated consultants would handle differently. The psychological impact was profound and unexpected. I had built Thompson and Associates through 20 years of careful decision-making, relationship development, and gradual expansion. Our client retention rate was over 95%. Our revenue had grown consistently even during economic downturns, and our reputation in the Cincinnati business community was excellent. Yet somehow, Sarah's critique had made me feel like an amateur pretending to understand a game whose rules had fundamentally changed. This self-doubt manifested in tangible ways that began affecting my business performance. I started declining speaking opportunities at regional business conferences. Convinced that my perspectives were no longer relevant, I hesitated to propose innovative solutions to client challenges, worried that my ideas would seem unsophisticated compared to whatever cutting-edge approaches other firms might offer. Most damaging of all, I began losing the confidence that had always been my greatest asset in client relationships. Business owners had always trusted me because I projected certainty and competence. But now, when discussing complex financial strategies or operational improvements, I found myself hedging my recommendations with qualifiers and uncertainties that undermined my credibility. The first real consequence came in March 2012, when I lost a significant prospective client to a larger regional firm. Hartman Manufacturing had been considering Thompson and Associates for comprehensive financial management and business consulting services, exactly the kind of high-value engagement that had become our specialty. During the final presentation, everything went wrong. Instead of confidently outlining our proven approach to operational efficiency and strategic planning, I spent too much time acknowledging alternative methodologies and sophisticated analytical tools that other firms might employ. I essentially talked myself out of the contract by suggesting that the client might benefit from more advanced capabilities than we could provide. Mrs. Thompson, the company's CEO, Jennifer Hartman, said after my presentation, "You clearly know your business, but you don't seem entirely confident in your recommendations. We need advisors who believe strongly in their approach and can guide us decisively through challenging decisions." She was absolutely right, of course. I had allowed Sarah and Bradley's assessment to undermine the very qualities that had made me successful. But recognizing the problem and solving it were two different challenges entirely. The crisis deepened when one of my longtime employees, David Chen, approached me with concerns about the firm's direction. David had been with Thompson and Associates for 8 years, starting as a junior accountant and working his way up to senior associate. He was brilliant with numbers, excellent with clients, and had always been one of my most trusted team members. "Margaret, I need to talk to you about something that's been bothering me," he said during our regular monthly review meeting in April 2012. "Over the past few months, I've noticed that you seem less decisive than usual. You're questioning strategies that have worked well for us, and some of the clients have mentioned that you seem uncertain about recommendations you're making." David's observation was tactful but unmistakable. My crisis of confidence was becoming visible to both employees and clients, which meant it was threatening the stability of everything I had built. "I've been considering some strategic changes to keep us competitive," I replied, trying to maintain professional composure while internally struggling with the accuracy of his assessment. "What kind of changes?" David asked. "Because from my perspective, we're already extremely competitive. Our client satisfaction scores are excellent, our retention rates are industry-leading, and our revenue per client has increased every year for the past 5 years. I'm not sure what we need to fix." His questions forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. I was attempting to solve problems that didn't actually exist. Thompson and Associates wasn't struggling because of outdated methodologies or insufficient sophistication. We were struggling because I had lost faith in the very approaches that had made us successful. That realization led to what I now recognize as the lowest point of this entire experience. In May 2012, I seriously considered selling Thompson and Associates to a larger firm and either retiring early or accepting a subordinate role in someone else's organization. At 46 years old, I was ready to abandon everything I had built because I had been convinced that my professional approach was fundamentally inadequate. I was researching potential acquisition firms when something completely unexpected happened that would eventually change the entire trajectory of my career. I received a phone call from Marcus Rodriguez, the Regional Director for Premier Business Solutions, one of the largest accounting and consulting firms in the Midwest. "Mrs. Thompson, Marcus said during our initial conversation. "I've been following Thompson and Associates for several years, and I'm impressed by what you've accomplished. We're expanding our Cincinnati operations, and we're looking for experienced professionals who understand this market and have established client relationships." Premier Business Solutions was exactly the kind of firm that Sarah and Bradley would have considered sophisticated and modern. They employed over 800 people across 6 states, worked with Fortune 500 clients, and used the latest analytical software and consulting methodologies. More importantly, they were offering me a senior director position that would essentially triple my current salary, while giving me access to resources and technologies that Thompson and Associates could never afford independently. "We're particularly interested in your expertise with middle-market clients," Marcus continued. "Your reputation for developing long-term relationships and helping businesses navigate complex operational challenges is exactly what we need to differentiate our services in this region." The irony was remarkable. The same relationship-focused, practical problem-solving approach that Sarah had dismissed as dated was being valued by a major firm as a competitive advantage. Premier wasn't looking to replace my methodologies with more sophisticated alternatives. They wanted to incorporate my proven strategies into their broader service offerings. I arranged to meet with Marcus and his team the following week, ostensibly to discuss the position offer, but really to understand whether my professional capabilities were as outdated as I had been led to believe. The meeting took place at Premier's downtown Cincinnati offices, a gleaming 30-floor tower that housed some of the region's most prestigious professional services firms. Marcus introduced me to 3 other senior executives, including Rebecca Walsh, Premier's National Director of Client Services, who had flown in from Chicago specifically for our meeting. Rebecca had an MBA from Kellogg and 15 years of experience with major consulting firms, exactly the kind of credentials that Sarah and Bradley considered essential for serious business professionals. "Margaret," Rebecca said after reviewing my professional background and Thompson and Associates client portfolio, "we've done extensive research on regional business consulting markets, and your firm consistently appears as a benchmark for client satisfaction and long-term relationship management. That's not easy to achieve, especially in competitive markets." She went on to explain that Premier had analyzed dozens of smaller firms across their expansion territories, and Thompson and Associates ranked in the top 5% for client retention, revenue per engagement, and referral generation. These metrics, she noted, were far more predictive of sustainable business success than the kind of theoretical sophistication that many newer consultants emphasized. "The truth is," Rebecca continued, "we've worked with plenty of brilliant analysts who can build complex financial models, but struggle to develop the trust relationships that drive real business development. Your track record suggests that you've mastered both the technical competencies and the interpersonal skills that make consulting truly valuable." I listened to this assessment with growing amazement. Premier's research team had conducted exactly the kind of rigorous analysis that Sarah and Bradley would have respected, and their conclusions directly contradicted everything my daughter had told me about my professional limitations. Marcus presented their offer in detail: a senior director position with a $180,000 base salary plus performance bonuses that could easily exceed $50,000 annually. I would manage a team of 12 consultants working with middle-market clients throughout Ohio and Kentucky, with full authority to implement the relationship management strategies that had made Thompson and Associates successful. "We're not asking you to abandon your approach," Marcus explained. "We're asking you to scale it up and teach it to other professionals who can apply your methodologies across a much larger client base." The position would require relocating to Columbus, Ohio, and surrendering the independence that had been central to my professional identity for over a decade. But it would also provide access to resources, technologies, and professional development opportunities that could exponentially expand my impact and earning potential. I asked for 2 weeks to consider the offer, but I knew immediately that this opportunity represented something much more significant than a career change. It was a chance to test Sarah and Bradley's assessment of my professional capabilities in an environment where theoretical sophistication and practical experience could be directly compared. If I could succeed at Premier Business Solutions, if I could demonstrate that my outdated methodologies were actually valuable enough to scale across a major consulting firm, then perhaps Sarah's dismissive evaluation said more about her own limitations than mine. The decision would prove to be one of the most important of my life. though not for the reasons I initially expected. What I thought would be a straightforward career transition would ultimately become the foundation for a professional transformation that would surprise everyone involved, including my daughter, who was about to learn that experience, wisdom, and practical knowledge could compete quite effectively with theoretical sophistication and prestigious credentials. The decision to accept Premier Business Solutions' offer required more courage than I had anticipated. After spending over a decade building Thompson & Associates into exactly the kind of business I had always envisioned, the prospect of surrendering that independence to work for someone else felt like admitting defeat, even though the logical part of my mind recognized this as an extraordinary opportunity. I spent countless hours over those 2 weeks analyzing every aspect of the decision. The financial benefits were undeniable. Premier was offering nearly 3 times my current income, comprehensive benefits, and access to professional development resources that could significantly expand my capabilities. The professional validation was equally appealing. Joining a prestigious firm would essentially prove that my skills were valuable enough to compete in sophisticated business environments. But there were also substantial risks. I would be giving up the autonomy that had defined my career for over 20 years. Instead of making independent decisions about client service and business strategy, I would be implementing corporate policies and working within established frameworks that might not align with my preferred approaches. Most challenging of all, I would be starting over in a new environment where I would need to prove myself all over again. At 46 years old, I would be the new person trying to establish credibility among colleagues who had worked together for years and who might view my small firm background as less impressive than their corporate experience. The conversation that ultimately convinced me to take the leap came from an unexpected source. I called Harold Morrison, my former mentor, who had retired to Florida but maintained an interest in regional business developments. Harold had always been a reliable source of practical wisdom, and I trusted his judgment about professional decisions. "Margaret," Harold said after I explained the situation, "you're asking the wrong question. You're wondering whether you're good enough to succeed at Premier. But you should be asking whether Premier is good enough to deserve your talents." He went on to explain something that I hadn't fully appreciated about my own professional development. Over the years, Harold had watched me solve business problems and build client relationships in ways that demonstrated natural capabilities that couldn't be taught through formal education or corporate training programs. "You have an intuitive understanding of how businesses actually operate," he continued. "Not how they're supposed to operate according to textbooks or case studies, but how they really function when dealing with competitive pressures, cash flow challenges, and operational inefficiencies. That kind of practical intelligence is much rarer than you realize." Harold's perspective helped me recognize that joining Premier wasn't about proving that I could adapt to more sophisticated business practices. It was about demonstrating that sophisticated business practices could benefit from the kind of real-world experience I had accumulated. I called Marcus Rodriguez on a Friday afternoon in late May 2012 and accepted Premier's offer. The transition timeline was aggressive. I needed to complete the sale of Thompson & Associates, relocate to Columbus, and begin work by September 1st. It was exactly the kind of compressed schedule that would have terrified me 6 months earlier, but somehow the prospect of a completely fresh start felt energizing, rather than overwhelming. Selling Thompson & Associates proved to be less emotionally difficult than I had expected. David Chen and 2 other senior employees arranged financing to purchase the firm as a partnership, which meant that our existing clients would continue working with people they already knew and trusted. The sale price was fair, and I retained a small equity stake that would provide ongoing income for several years. More importantly, the sale validated everything I had built. 3 intelligent, capable professionals were willing to invest their own money to acquire a business that Sarah had characterized as fundamentally outdated. Either my daughter was wrong about the value of what I had created, or these new owners were making a serious financial mistake. Time would tell which assessment was accurate. I moved to Columbus in late August 2012, renting a furnished apartment in the Short North District while I searched for a permanent residence. Columbus felt dramatically different from Cincinnati, larger, more energetic, with a cosmopolitan atmosphere that reflected its status as both a state capital and a major university town. For the first time in decades, I was living somewhere that no one knew my personal history or professional background. My first day at Premier Business Solutions was scheduled for Tuesday, September 4th. I arrived at their downtown offices at 7:30 a.m., wearing a new suit and carrying a leather portfolio that contained carefully prepared notes about my goals and expectations for the position. The building was impressive. 38 floors of glass and steel that housed some of Ohio's most prestigious law firms, financial institutions, and consulting companies. Premier occupied the entire 26th floor, with modern offices, state-of-the-art conference rooms, and technology infrastructure that was far more sophisticated than anything I had used at Thompson & Associates. The atmosphere was unmistakably corporate, efficient, professional, and slightly intimidating for someone accustomed to the more casual environment of a small firm. Marcus Rodriguez met me in the reception area and introduced me to Rebecca Walsh, who had traveled from Chicago to personally oversee my integration into the company. Rebecca had prepared a comprehensive orientation schedule that would introduce me to key personnel, familiarize me with Premier's service methodologies, and begin the process of transitioning existing relationships to my oversight. "Margaret," Rebecca explained as we reviewed the schedule, "we're starting you with a portfolio of 12 client relationships that have been managed by different team members over the past 2 years. These are established accounts, but they haven't been receiving the kind of consistent, high-level attention that drives real business development." She handed me detailed files on each client: manufacturing companies, healthcare organizations, and technology firms with annual revenues ranging from $15 million to $85 million. These were exactly the kind of middle-market businesses that had been Thompson & Associates' specialty, but they were significantly larger and more complex than most of my previous clients. "The goal is to demonstrate how relationship-focused consulting can increase client satisfaction and generate additional revenue opportunities," Rebecca continued. "If this pilot program succeeds, we'll expand your approach across our entire Midwest region." I spent the first week immersing myself in client histories, financial analyses, and operational assessments that previous consultants had prepared. The work was thorough and technically competent, but it lacked the kind of strategic insights that come from understanding each business's unique competitive challenges and growth opportunities. More concerning, many of the client files contained notes suggesting that business owners were frustrated with Premier's service delivery. Comments like "wants more frequent communication" and "requesting more practical recommendations" appeared repeatedly, indicating that Premier's sophisticated analytical capabilities weren't translating into the kind of actionable guidance that clients needed. My first client meeting was scheduled for Thursday, September 13th, with Jennifer Morrison, the CEO of Morrison Logistics, a regional transportation company that had been working with Premier for 18 months. According to the client file, Morrison Logistics was considering terminating their consulting relationship due to dissatisfaction with the strategic recommendations they had received. I spent 3 days preparing for the meeting, reviewing every aspect of Morrison Logistics operations, financial performance, and industry position. But instead of developing a formal presentation filled with charts and analytical frameworks, I decided to approach the meeting as a conversation focused on understanding Jennifer's specific concerns and objectives. The meeting took place at Morrison Logistics headquarters in suburban Columbus, a modest office building that housed their dispatch operations and administrative functions. Jennifer Morrison was a woman in her early 50s who had inherited the company from her father and spent 20 years building it from a small local operation into a regional player with 200 employees and $35 million in annual revenue. "Mrs. Thompson," Jennifer said as we settled into her office, "I'll be honest with you. Premier has provided us with some very sophisticated analysis over the past year and a half, but most of their recommendations don't seem practical for a company our size. We need concrete solutions to specific problems, not theoretical frameworks." Instead of defending Premier's previous work, I asked Jennifer to describe the most pressing challenges facing her business. For the next hour, she outlined operational inefficiencies, competitive pressures, and growth opportunities that weren't adequately addressed in any of the consulting reports I had reviewed. "What we really need," Jennifer concluded, "is someone who understands how businesses like ours actually operate on a day-to-day basis. We don't need cutting-edge analytical tools. We need practical strategies that we can implement with our existing resources and capabilities." I realized immediately that Morrison Logistics represented exactly the kind of client relationship where my approach could demonstrate clear advantages over purely theoretical consulting. Jennifer needed an advisor who combined financial expertise with operational understanding, someone who could translate strategic concepts into actionable implementation plans. "Jennifer," I replied, "let me propose something different. Instead of presenting you with another analysis of your business, I'd like to spend some time observing your operations firsthand. I want to understand how your dispatch system actually works, what challenges your drivers face, and where inefficiencies occur in your daily workflow." Jennifer's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "That would be incredibly helpful. Most consultants want to analyze our numbers from their offices, but they never really understand how our business actually functions." Over the following 3 weeks, I spent approximately 20 hours at Morrison Logistics, observing operations, interviewing employees, and identifying specific opportunities for improvement. Instead of relying solely on financial statements and industry benchmarks, I developed recommendations based on direct observation of their actual business processes. The results were remarkable. I identified operational changes that could reduce fuel costs by 8%, scheduling modifications that could increase driver productivity by 12%, and customer service improvements that could justify premium pricing for expedited services. More importantly, all of these recommendations could be implemented using existing personnel and resources without requiring significant capital investment. When I presented these findings to Jennifer in early October, her reaction exceeded my most optimistic expectations. "This is exactly what we needed," she said, reviewing the implementation timeline I had prepared. "These aren't theoretical possibilities. These are practical solutions that we can start implementing immediately." Morrison Logistics became my first major success at Premier, but it was far from my last. Word spread quickly through Columbus's business community that Premier had hired someone who combined analytical sophistication with practical implementation expertise. Within 6 months, I was managing relationships with 18 clients, and my portfolio was generating 35% more revenue than it had under previous management. More significantly, client satisfaction scores for my accounts were consistently higher than Premier's company average. Business owners appreciated working with someone who understood their operational realities and could translate complex financial concepts into actionable strategies. By spring 2013, Rebecca Walsh was asking me to develop training materials that could teach other Premier consultants to incorporate relationship-focused methodologies into their client service approaches. The same practical, experience-based strategies that Sarah had dismissed as outdated were being recognized by a major consulting firm as competitive advantages worth scaling across their entire organization. The irony was not lost on me. Everything my daughter had criticized about my professional approach, the emphasis on relationships over analytical sophistication, the focus on practical implementation over theoretical frameworks, the preference for gradual trust building over impressive presentations, was proving to be exactly what distinguished successful consulting from merely competent analysis. But the real validation was still to come, in ways that would surprise everyone involved and fundamentally change how I understood my own professional capabilities. By the summer of 2013, my position at Premier Business Solutions had evolved far beyond what anyone had originally envisioned. What began as a senior director role managing middle-market client relationships had expanded into something approaching a regional transformation of how the firm approached business development and client service. The success with Morrison Logistics had created a ripple effect throughout Premier's Columbus operations. Jennifer Morrison had recommended my services to 3 other transportation companies, 2 of which became Premier clients, specifically because they wanted to work with someone who understood their industry from an operational perspective. This kind of organic business development was unusual for Premier, where most new clients came through formal proposals and competitive bidding processes. Rebecca Walsh took notice immediately. During our quarterly review in June 2013, she presented data showing that my client portfolio was outperforming company benchmarks in every meaningful metric: revenue per engagement, client retention rates, referral generation, and satisfaction scores. "Margaret," Rebecca said, reviewing the performance analytics, "your clients are generating 40% more revenue than our regional average. and their satisfaction scores are consistently in the 95th percentile. More importantly, you're driving business development in ways that our traditional marketing approaches haven't achieved. She explained that Premier's corporate leadership was closely monitoring my results because they represented a potential solution to challenges the firm was facing across multiple markets. Despite their reputation for analytical sophistication, Premier was struggling to differentiate their services from competitors who offered similar technical capabilities at comparable prices. The consulting industry has become commoditized in many ways, Rebecca continued. Clients can get sophisticated financial analysis from dozens of firms. What they can't get everywhere is the kind of strategic insight that comes from really understanding their businesses and building genuine advisory relationships. This conversation led to an unexpected development that would fundamentally change my career trajectory. Premier's executive committee was so impressed with my results that they were creating a new regional position specifically designed around my approach to client service. The role would make me Director of Strategic Client Development for the Midwest region, with responsibility for training other consultants and implementing relationship-focused methodologies across Premier's Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan operations. The promotion came with a substantial salary increase. My base compensation would rise to $240,000, with performance bonuses that could easily exceed $100,000 annually. More importantly, I would have authority to hire additional staff, develop new service offerings, and essentially scale the practical, relationship-based approach that had made my individual client work so successful. I accepted the promotion in August 2013, and by September I was traveling throughout the Midwest, working with Premier's regional teams to implement what the company was calling the Thompson method of client development. The irony of having a major consulting firm name a methodology after someone whose skills had been dismissed as outdated was not lost on me, though I kept those observations to myself. The implementation process required me to conduct training workshops for consultants who had been hired specifically for their analytical capabilities and advanced academic credentials. Many of these professionals had MBAs from prestigious programs and years of experience with sophisticated financial modeling, but they struggled with the interpersonal aspects of consulting that I considered fundamental to the work. During one particularly memorable training session in Detroit, I worked with a team of 8 consultants who were having difficulty maintaining long-term client relationships. These were brilliant analysts who could build complex financial projections and identify operational inefficiencies with remarkable precision, but their clients consistently rated them as, quote, technically competent, but not strategically helpful. The problem, I explained to the group, is that you're solving the wrong problems. You're analyzing what you can measure rather than addressing what actually matters to these business owners. I spent the afternoon teaching them to conduct what I called operational interviews. Conversations focused on understanding the daily challenges, competitive pressures, and growth aspirations that shaped each client's decision-making process. Instead of leading with analytical frameworks, I showed them how to build recommendations around the practical realities of implementation, resource constraints, and organizational capabilities. The results were immediate and measurable. Within 6 months, the Detroit team's client satisfaction scores had improved by 25%, and they had generated 4 new client relationships through referrals, something that had never happened in their previous work. Similar improvements occurred across every regional office where we implemented the Thompson method. Premier's corporate leadership was so impressed with these results that they began incorporating relationship-focused training into their national orientation program for new consultants. By early 2014, I was being invited to speak at industry conferences about innovative approaches to business consulting. The Ohio Society of CPAs asked me to deliver the keynote address at their annual convention, and the Midwest Business Development Association featured my work in their quarterly publication as an example of transformational consulting practices. These speaking opportunities led to unexpected recognition from professional organizations that I had never imagined would be interested in my work. In March 2014, I received notification that I had been selected as one of Ohio's top 40 under 50 business leaders by Columbus Business First, a recognition that seemed particularly ironic given that I was actually 48 years old and had spent most of my career being dismissed as unsophisticated. But the most significant recognition came in April 2014, when I received a call from Dr. Patricia Williams, the Dean of the Fisher College of Business at Ohio State University. Dr. Williams explained that the business school was developing a new executive education program focused on practical business consulting, and they wanted to offer me a position as an adjunct professor teaching strategic client development. Professor Thompson, Dr. Williams said, the title still sounded surreal to me. We've been following your work at Premier, and we're impressed by your ability to translate theoretical business concepts into practical implementation strategies. That's exactly the kind of applied expertise that our executive education students need. The Ohio State opportunity represented validation at a level one had never imagined possible. One of the country's leading business schools was asking someone with a community college background and no advanced degrees to teach graduate-level courses to experienced professionals. The position would require me to develop curriculum, conduct research, and essentially codify the practical approaches that had driven my success at Premier. I accepted the adjunct professorship and began teaching my first course, Strategic Relationship Development in Business Consulting, in the fall of 2014. My students were primarily experienced professionals seeking to advance their consulting capabilities: CPAs, business analysts, corporate strategists, and independent consultants who wanted to differentiate their services in competitive markets. What surprised me most about the teaching experience was how much my students valued the practical, experience-based insights that I had always considered common sense. These were intelligent, well-educated professionals who possessed sophisticated analytical skills, but they struggled with the interpersonal and strategic thinking aspects of consulting that I had developed through decades of real-world problem-solving. Professor Thompson, one student commented after a particularly intensive workshop on client relationship management. This is the first time anyone has explained how to actually apply business theory to real operational challenges. Most of our training focuses on analytical techniques, but you're teaching us how to think strategically about implementation and change management. The teaching position also led to consulting opportunities that extended far beyond Premier's client base. Business schools from other universities began inviting me to conduct workshops and guest lectures. Professional associations asked me to develop training materials for their members. Corporate clients started requesting me specifically for strategic projects that required both analytical sophistication and practical implementation expertise. By late 2014, my professional profile had been completely transformed. I was earning nearly $400,000 annually through my combined roles at Premier, Ohio State, and independent consulting engagements. More importantly, I had established a national reputation as an expert in strategic business consulting and relationship development. The transformation was so dramatic that it began attracting attention from business publications and professional media. In December 2014, I was featured in a Harvard Business Review article about the new model for business consulting that highlighted my approach as an example of how practical experience could enhance rather than compete with analytical sophistication. Margaret Thompson represents a new generation of business consultants who combine rigorous analytical training with deep operational understanding, the article explained. Her success demonstrates that the most effective consulting emerges from the intersection of theoretical knowledge and practical experience. The Harvard Business Review feature led to additional media opportunities, including interviews with Forbes, Inc. magazine, and several industry trade publications. Each article emphasized the same themes. My unconventional background had become a competitive advantage, and my relationship-focused approach was helping to redefine professional consulting in ways that purely analytical firms couldn't match. But perhaps the most satisfying recognition came from an unexpected source. In January 2015, I received a letter from Harold Morrison, my former mentor who had encouraged me to take the leap to Premier Business Solutions. Harold had been following my career developments through mutual contacts in the Cincinnati business community, and he wanted to share his perspective on what I had accomplished. Margaret, Harold wrote, when I first hired you as an office manager 25 years ago, I recognized that you possessed natural business instincts that couldn't be taught through formal education. What I didn't anticipate was how those instincts would eventually become the foundation for innovations that would influence an entire industry. Harold's letter reminded me of something crucial that I had lost sight of during my crisis of confidence. The skills that Sarah and Bradley had dismissed as outdated were actually the result of decades of practical experience that couldn't be replicated through academic training or theoretical study. My ability to understand business operations, build client relationships, and develop implementable strategies wasn't inferior to more sophisticated approaches. It was complementary to them in ways that created unique value. This realization would prove essential for what was about to become the most challenging and rewarding phase of my professional journey. Because unknown to me, my growing national reputation was about to intersect with Sarah and Bradley's career ambitions in ways that would test everything I had learned about the relationship between theoretical knowledge and practical experience. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would finally resolve the question of whether my outdated skills could compete with the sophisticated credentials and prestigious connections that my daughter and her husband had always considered superior. But the answer would surprise everyone involved, including myself. The phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning in March 2015. I was in my office at Premier, reviewing proposals for a new client engagement, when my assistant Jennifer knocked on my door with an expression that suggested something unusual was happening. "Margaret, there's someone from McKinsey & Company on line 3, she said. "They're requesting a meeting about a potential collaboration on a major client project. They specifically asked for you by name." McKinsey & Company, Sarah's employer and one of the most prestigious consulting firms in the world. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest as I considered the possibilities. Could this somehow involve my daughter? After more than 3 years of minimal contact, was this coincidence? Or something more complicated? The caller was James Patterson, a senior partner in McKinsey's Chicago office. His tone was professional, but urgent, as he explained the situation that had prompted their outreach. "Professor Thompson," he began. I still felt a small thrill every time someone used that title. "We have a significant client engagement that requires expertise in middle-market business operations and regional economic development. Your reputation for strategic relationship management and practical implementation has come to our attention through several industry sources." James explained that McKinsey had been retained by Meridian Capital, a private equity firm, to evaluate potential acquisitions in the Midwest manufacturing sector. The project involved analyzing dozens of companies with revenues between $25 million and $150 million. Exactly the size range where my expertise was most applicable. "The challenge," James continued, "is that our analytical capabilities are excellent for financial modeling and market analysis, but we need someone who understands how these businesses actually operate on a day-to-day basis. We need practical insights about operational efficiency, management capabilities, and growth potential that can only come from hands-on experience." The irony was breathtaking. McKinsey & Company, the firm that represented everything Sarah considered sophisticated and modern about business consulting, was requesting my help because they recognized that their theoretical expertise needed to be supplemented by practical experience. "We'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss a consulting partnership," James concluded. "Would you be available to meet with our project team next week? We can arrange to come to Columbus, or if you prefer, we could meet at our Chicago offices." I suggested we meet in Chicago, partly for convenience, but mostly because I was curious to see McKinsey's offices and understand how they approached client work. We scheduled the meeting for the following Thursday, giving me time to research Meridian Capital and prepare for what could potentially be the most significant professional opportunity of my career. The McKinsey offices occupied several floors of a downtown Chicago skyscraper, with conference rooms that overlooked Lake Michigan and technology infrastructure that made Premier's sophisticated systems look modest by comparison. I arrived 30 minutes early and spent time in their reception area, observing the controlled energy of consultants moving between meetings, their conversations filled with the same theoretical language that Sarah and Bradley had always used. James Patterson met me promptly at 2 p.m. and escorted me to a conference room where I would be meeting with the Meridian Capital project team. As we walked through hallways lined with awards and recognition plaques, James explained that this engagement represented one of McKinsey's largest private equity consulting contracts of the year. "The Meridian team is particularly interested in your perspective," James said as we approached the conference room. "They've reviewed your work at Premier and your academic publications, and they're impressed by your ability to identify operational improvements that traditional financial analysis might miss. James opened the conference room door, and I stepped inside to find myself face to face with the last people I had expected to encounter in this context. Seated at the polished conference table, reviewing documents and preparing for the meeting, were Sarah and Bradley. The shock was mutual and immediate. Sarah looked up from her laptop with an expression that progressed rapidly from surprise to confusion to something approaching horror. Bradley's reaction was more controlled, but I could see the same discomfort in his carefully composed features. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" James Patterson looked between us with obvious confusion. "You know each other?" "This is my mother," Sarah replied, still seemingly unable to process the situation. "But I don't understand why she's here." "Your mother is Professor Margaret Thompson," James explained matter-of-factly. "She's the strategic consulting expert we've retained to provide operational analysis for the Meridian project. Her expertise in middle-market business assessment is exactly what we need for this engagement." I watched Sarah and Bradley exchange glances that conveyed volumes of unspoken communication. They were clearly struggling to reconcile their image of me as an outdated small-town accountant with McKinsey's description of me as a strategic consulting expert worthy of collaboration on a major private equity project. "There must be some mistake," Bradley said, his tone carefully diplomatic. "Mrs. Thompson runs a small accounting practice in Cincinnati. I'm not sure her background aligns with the sophistication level that Meridian Capital expects for strategic due diligence." James Patterson's response was swift and definitive. "Actually, Professor Thompson is Director of Strategic Client Development for Premier Business Solutions, one of the Midwest's leading consulting firms. She's also an adjunct professor at Ohio State's Fisher College of Business, and has been featured in Harvard Business Review for her innovative approaches to strategic consulting." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. I could see Sarah processing this information, trying to understand how the mother she had dismissed as professionally irrelevant had somehow achieved recognition that impressed McKinsey and Company. "Perhaps we should proceed with the meeting," I suggested, attempting to restore professional normalcy to what had become an intensely personal moment. "I'm sure Meridian Capital has specific requirements that we should focus on addressing." Over the next 2 hours, we reviewed the scope of the private equity project in excruciating detail. Meridian was considering acquisitions in automotive parts manufacturing, industrial equipment production, and specialty chemical processing, industries where operational efficiency and management capability were often more important than financial engineering. As the meeting progressed, it became increasingly clear that my practical experience provided insights that McKinsey's analytical frameworks couldn't generate independently. When we discussed potential acquisition targets, I could identify operational red flags and competitive advantages that weren't apparent from financial statements or industry reports. For example, I explained while reviewing the profile of a potential automotive supplier, "This company's profit margins look impressive, but their customer concentration is extremely risky. 80% of their revenue comes from 2 major auto manufacturers, and both of those companies are under pressure to reduce supplier costs. Any acquisition strategy would need to address customer diversification immediately." Sarah and Bradley listened to my analysis with expressions that suggested they were seeing me clearly for the first time. The insights I was providing weren't based on sophisticated analytical models. They emerged from decades of helping businesses navigate competitive challenges and operational difficulties. "That's an excellent point," James Patterson acknowledged. "Our financial analysis identified the customer concentration, but we hadn't fully considered the strategic implications for post-acquisition value creation." As the meeting continued, I found myself essentially leading the strategic discussion, while Sarah and Bradley contributed technical analysis and financial modeling. The dynamic was exactly the reverse of what our family interactions had suggested about our relative professional capabilities. When we broke for coffee midway through the meeting, Sarah approached me with an expression that combined professional respect with personal confusion. "Mom, I had no idea you were working at this level," she said quietly. "When did all of this happen? The last time we talked about your business, you were running that small firm in Cincinnati." "That was over 3 years ago, Sarah," I replied gently. "A lot has changed since then." Bradley joined our conversation, and I could see him struggling to recalibrate his assessment of my professional standing. Mrs. Thompson, I have to admit that your insights about operational due diligence are quite sophisticated. Where did you develop expertise in private equity analysis? I didn't, I answered honestly. But I've spent 30 years helping business owners understand their operations, identify inefficiencies, and develop growth strategies. Those same principles apply whether you're consulting for a family business or evaluating acquisition targets for private equity. When we reconvened, James Patterson outlined McKinsey's proposal for our collaboration. They wanted me to conduct on-site operational assessments of Meridian's top 12 acquisition candidates, providing detailed reports on management capability, operational efficiency, and implementation feasibility for post-acquisition improvements. The engagement would run for approximately 6 months, James explained, with compensation at our standard external expert rate of $450 per hour, plus expenses and performance bonuses based on deal completion. I did quick mental calculations and realized that this single project could generate over $300,000 in consulting fees, more than I had earned in entire years during my early career. But more important than the financial opportunity was the professional validation it represented. McKinsey & Company, the consulting firm that Sarah had always referenced as the pinnacle of business sophistication, was essentially acknowledging that my practical experience provided value that their theoretical expertise couldn't replicate. They were willing to pay premium rates for insights that emerged from the same relationship-focused, operations-oriented approach that Sarah had dismissed as outdated. After we concluded the formal meeting, James Patterson asked if I could begin work immediately on preliminary assessments of 3 priority targets. The timeline was aggressive, but I had learned to thrive under pressure during my years of building Thompson & Associates while raising Sarah as a single mother. I can start next week, I confirmed. I'll need access to management teams and facility tours for each target company, plus whatever financial documentation Meridian is willing to share. As we gathered our materials and prepared to leave, Sarah lingered in the conference room, while Bradley spoke with James about technical details of the engagement. "Mom," she said hesitantly, "I owe you an apology. I clearly didn't understand what you had accomplished professionally. This is really impressive." I looked at my daughter. Brilliant, accomplished, successful in every way I had hoped when she was growing up, and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in her achievements, certainly, but also sadness that it had taken a chance encounter in a McKinsey conference room for her to recognize the value of what I had built. "Thank you, Sarah," I replied. "But you should know that everything I'm doing now grew directly from the foundation I built at Thompson & Associates. The skills you criticized as outdated are exactly what allowed me to succeed at this level." As I prepared to leave McKinsey's offices that afternoon, I reflected on the unexpected turn my career had taken. 3 years earlier, Sarah's assessment of my professional limitations had nearly convinced me to abandon everything I had worked to build. Now, that same daughter was witnessing me collaborate as an equal with the most prestigious consulting firm in the world. Passion to world. But this was only the beginning of a professional dynamic that would become far more complex and challenging than any of us anticipated. Because what started as a consulting collaboration was about to evolve into a direct competition that would test everything I had learned about the relationship between theoretical sophistication and practical experience. The Meridian Capital project consumed the next 4 months of my life, but it would prove to be far more than just another consulting engagement. It became the crucible where everything I had learned about business, relationships, and my own capabilities would be tested in ways I never could have anticipated. Working alongside Sarah and Bradley on a daily basis created a dynamic unlike anything I had ever experienced. For the first time in our adult relationship, we were functioning as professional equals. Actually, given my role as the lead operational consultant, I was effectively their senior on this project. The transformation in their attitudes was gradual but unmistakable. During our first week of site visits to potential acquisition targets, I watched Sarah observe my interactions with management teams and operational staff. Where McKinsey's traditional approach involved formal presentations and structured interviews, I spent time walking factory floors, talking with supervisors, and understanding the practical challenges that shaped each company's performance. At Hendrix Manufacturing, a precision machining company in Indiana, I identified critical operational inefficiencies that weren't apparent from their financial statements. The company appeared profitable on paper, but their production scheduling system was creating massive waste and customer service problems that would only worsen under private equity ownership. "How did you see that so quickly?" Sarah asked as we drove back to our hotel after a 10-hour assessment visit. "Their numbers looked solid in our financial analysis." "Because I've seen this pattern dozens of times," I explained. "When a manufacturing company has good margins but inconsistent delivery performance, it usually means they're optimizing for the wrong metrics. They're focusing on unit costs instead of total customer value." Over the following weeks, Sarah began asking more questions about my methodology and observational techniques. She started accompanying me on factory floor visits instead of staying in conference rooms with financial documents. I watched her develop insights about business operations that her MBA training had never provided. Bradley's evolution was more reluctant but equally significant. His strength lay in financial modeling and market analysis, but he gradually acknowledged that his recommendations needed to be grounded in operational reality to be implementable. "Your assessment of Wagner Industrials saved us from a serious mistake," he admitted after I identified fundamental problems with a company that looked attractive from a financial perspective. "We would have recommended that acquisition based purely on the numbers, but your operational analysis showed why it would have been a disaster." The validation wasn't just personal, it was professional, in ways that exceeded my most ambitious expectations. James Patterson and the McKinsey team began requesting my input on strategic decisions that went far beyond operational assessment. They wanted my perspective on market positioning, competitive strategy, and post-acquisition value creation. By July 2015, Meridian Capital had completed 3 successful acquisitions based on our recommendations, with projected returns that exceeded their initial targets by 15 to 20%. My operational due diligence had identified value creation opportunities that traditional financial analysis had missed, and my implementation strategies had accelerated integration timelines significantly. The success led to an offer that would once again transform my career trajectory. Charles Morrison, Meridian's founding partner, invited me to dinner at one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants to discuss what he called a strategic opportunity. "Margaret," Charles said over dinner, "your work on this project has been extraordinary. You've demonstrated capabilities that frankly don't exist anywhere else in our network. I want to offer you a position as Director of Operational Strategy for Meridian Capital. The role would make me responsible for operational due diligence across all of Meridian's potential investments, with equity participation in successful deals and compensation that would easily exceed $500,000 annually. More importantly, I would be building and leading a team that combined traditional financial analysis with the practical, relationship-based assessment methodologies I had developed." "We're not asking you to abandon your approach," Charles continued. "We're asking you to institutionalize it. We want to create a new model for private equity due diligence that acknowledges what you've proven, that operational understanding is often more predictive of success than financial engineering." I accepted Meridian's offer in August 2015, becoming one of the few non-finance professionals to hold a senior strategy position at a major private equity firm. The announcement generated attention throughout the industry, with several publications featuring articles about the growing importance of operational expertise in investment decision-making. But the most satisfying moment came during our final McKinsey project review meeting in September. Sarah, Bradley, James Patterson, and I were presenting our results to Meridian's investment committee, summarizing lessons learned from the 6-month engagement. When James was asked to identify the most valuable aspects of the collaboration, his response was unequivocal. Professor Thompson's operational insights were the differentiating factor in this project's success. Her ability to identify value creation opportunities and implementation challenges provided Meridian with competitive advantages that purely financial analysis couldn't deliver. Sarah was sitting directly across from me when James made this assessment, and I saw something in her expression that I had been hoping to see for years: genuine respect for my professional capabilities. Not grudging acknowledgement or surprised recognition, but authentic appreciation for expertise that she finally understood was both sophisticated and valuable. After the meeting, as we gathered our materials and prepared to return to our respective offices, Sarah asked if we could have dinner together, just the two of us, without Bradley or any business obligations. That evening, at a quiet restaurant near Northwestern's campus, where Sarah had first developed her ideas about business sophistication, we had the most honest conversation we had shared in years. Mom, I owe you more than an apology, Sarah began. I owe you an acknowledgement that I was completely wrong about your professional capabilities. What you've accomplished over the past few years is remarkable, but more than that, I realize now that your skills were always remarkable. I just couldn't see it. She went on to explain how working with me on the Meridian project had forced her to reconsider everything she had learned about business consulting and strategic analysis. The theoretical frameworks she had mastered at Northwestern and McKinsey were valuable, but they needed to be grounded in practical understanding to be truly effective. You were right when you said that experience and wisdom couldn't be replaced by analytical sophistication, Sarah continued. I spent years thinking that my education made me smarter than you, when actually it just made me more limited in how I approached problems. I listened to my daughter's words with emotions that were difficult to define. Relief, certainly, that our relationship could finally move beyond the professional dismissal that had shaped our interactions for so many years. Pride in her maturity and willingness to acknowledge her mistakes. But also sadness for the time we had lost to misunderstandings that now seemed so unnecessary. Sarah, I replied, you don't need to apologize for achieving everything I hoped you would achieve. Your education and professional success are exactly what I worked to make possible. The only mistake was thinking that different approaches to business problems meant that one was superior to the other. We talked until nearly midnight, discussing not just our professional relationship but our family history, her childhood memories, and her understanding of the sacrifices I had made to provide her with opportunities I never had. For the first time in years, we connected not as professionals defending different philosophical approaches to business, but as mother and daughter who loved and respected each other. 3 years later, in 2018, Sarah made a decision that completed her professional transformation. She left McKinsey to join Meridian Capital as a senior associate, working directly with my operational strategy team. Her analytical skills, combined with the practical insights she had learned through our collaboration, made her an extraordinarily effective addition to our investment evaluation process. Today, as I reflect on this entire journey from my office at Meridian Capital, yes, I now have a corner office in a Chicago skyscraper. I'm struck by how unpredictable professional life can be. The crisis of confidence that nearly ended my career led to opportunities I never could have imagined when I was that desperate single mother cleaning office buildings at night. Sarah and I now work together regularly, and Bradley has become a genuine friend whose respect for my professional judgment is evident in every interaction. The family dinners that once featured condescending assessments of my basic business approaches now include collaborative discussions about complex investment strategies and operational improvements. But perhaps the most important lesson I've learned is that professional validation can't and shouldn't depend on other people's recognition, even when those people are your own children. The skills, insights, and capabilities that allowed me to succeed at Premier Ohio State and Meridian existed long before anyone acknowledged them. They emerged from decades of practical experience, relationship building, and problem solving that couldn't be replicated through academic training or theoretical study. My outdated skills weren't outdated at all, they were timeless. And in a business world increasingly dominated by analytical sophistication and technological complexity, the ability to understand how organizations actually function and how people actually make decisions has become more valuable than ever. Sometimes the greatest professional triumph isn't proving that you're right. It's discovering that you were right all along and finding the courage to trust your own judgment even when everyone around you suggests otherwise. That confidence, more than any promotion or recognition, is what makes this story worth telling. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.